Hey, you. Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activated.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend, I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Stranded in space. It is one of the better 3-word premises for a story you can draw up. I am sure you're thinking of a good one right now.
I have no way to contact NASA, and even if I could, it's going to be 4 years until a manned mission can reach me.
Today, a spaceship comes home without its passengers. It remains to be seen if that craft will make it back to Earth intact. The astronauts who were supposed to be on it, they'll have to stay up there in space for, well, it's going to be a while. To add an extra wrinkle to this, the company that brought them to space will have to rely on its competitor to bring them home safely. And NASA? They get to figure out how to protect those astronauts while 2 private companies try to outdo one another in the space race. And meanwhile, those 2 astronauts will just be up there, waiting until sometime next year. And oh, there's a funny noise coming through the radio. Like I said, it's a pretty decent premise. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Joey Roulette is the space reporter for Reuters. He's been following the saga of a couple dudes just hanging out in space for a while, huh, Joey?
Yeah, it's been a weird story.
Who are these guys? Who are Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams? Where exactly in space are they right now?
Yeah, so Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams are 2 veteran NASA astronauts, and they're currently on the ISS for what was supposed to be an 8-day mission testing out Starliner, has actually turned into an 8-month mission. They've been on there for about 3 months now, but they're going to come home in February 2025.
And how did they get to the ISS in the first place? What was the actual purpose of their mission? You mentioned to test out Starliner. What's that?
Yeah, so Starliner is Boeing's next generation big crew capsule that is supposed to compete with SpaceX's Crew Dragon capsule. And that one has been ferrying NASA astronauts to and from the ISS since 2020. And so Boeing's trying to catch up. They have been building this gumdrop-shaped spacecraft for the same time as SpaceX has been. It's been taking Boeing a little longer. And this mission that launched in June was their first mission carrying astronauts. And those astronauts were Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams. And so the capsule experienced a lot of problems in this first test flight. It has flown to the ISS 2 times in the past without a crew. And so this was supposed to be the big step toward getting certified by NASA for this spacecraft. But obviously, now that it's going to come home empty and without the astronauts, that's all kind of thrown into disarray and uncertainty.
So is the space station equipped to keep them alive, I guess, until they can be brought back down? Like, do they have all the supplies they need? What are they going to eat while they're up there?
Yeah, so the ISS has been staffed continuously with astronauts for the last 20 years, more than 20 years. And they usually do long duration missions of about 6 months. And so the astronauts that rode Starliner there, now that they're going to be there for 8 months, that's not much different from a long duration mission that astronauts normally do. About 2 months ago or a month and a half ago, there was a cargo resupply mission that flew to the ISS in the middle of this Starliner mission. And while those astronauts were on the station, and on it were additional food, supplies that normally go up to the ISS on a routine basis, but especially there were supplies for these 2 astronauts too, in the event that their mission would be extended to February the following year. So they had already had a shipment of extra supplies, and there's at least one more cargo mission that is going to happen before they leave next year that will, again, replenish their supplies too. And And these cargo capsules contain food, clothes, little, things that they personally want to have on the ISS to, make living there for months on end more bearable.
For those who don't follow the space program incredibly closely, can you explain just briefly why SpaceX and Boeing are making these ships and why, NASA's no longer taking its astronauts up and down on its own, as I think it had done for decades, right?
Right. That's a good question. I mean, NASA's big thing is human space flight. They're known for flying humans in space and trying to go to the moon. They've gone to the moon under the Apollo program over 5 decades ago. But NASA has this International Space Station partnership with a number of countries, mainly Russia, that has been housing astronauts in space continuously for over 2 decades. And in the first, years of the ISS partnership, NASA had its own rockets called the Shuttle. Those are kind of the classic rockets that you see in movies and everything. Right. That was the Shuttle program, but that ended in 2011. And so for a few years after that, roughly a decade after that, NASA depended on Russia's Soyuz program to fly its astronauts to space. But meanwhile, NASA was trying to build its own capability and revive its own human spaceflight capability, relying on SpaceX and Boeing. NASA picked those 2 companies in 2014 to build these 2 spacecraft that were going to revive its ability to send its own astronauts to space from a U.S. capability. And so SpaceX developed Crew Dragon. Boeing had plans for Starliner. There was a race at some point. It was seen as a race to develop these spacecraft, even though Boeing and SpaceX would deny that. But, SpaceX ended up flying Crew Dragon first with humans in 2020, and Boeing flew an uncrewed test flight in 2019, which failed pretty spectacularly. There wasn't any explosion, but there were no humans on board, and it failed to reach the ISS. And so that kind of started a whole series of problems for Boeing, while SpaceX was suddenly relied upon as the primary crew transportation provider for NASA. And, Boeing's problems haven't ever really abated, while SpaceX has zoomed forward in the human spaceflight market and has flown over 13 missions now, I think, a combination of NASA missions and private astronaut missions using Crew Dragon.
I know we're here to talk about space today, but everybody listening keeps hearing the name Boeing, and I'm going to ask the question on their minds is doesn't Boeing have enough problems down here getting airplanes to fly regularly, never mind flying people to the space station?
I mean, yeah, and that's what is on the top of everybody's mind. And, especially before this mission, when I would tell my friends that I have to, cover this flight where Boeing's trying to send astronauts to space for the first time, they're like, aren't they having problems with their airplane program? Right. And so I'm like, yeah, and so Boeing was confident that this mission was going to, put it on track for certification. They were still admitting that there might be some problems along the way, and certainly there were. And, when we look at all the problems that Boeing has had on this Starliner program, it's not much different than what Boeing has experienced on its commercial airplanes division, which, of course, there have been hundreds of lives that have been lost on the airplane side, so it's not particularly equal. But I think much of the same engineering culture that brought you those airplanes brought you this Starliner capsule.
Well, let's talk about this Starliner capsule specifically. You mentioned it left in June. What happened? What went wrong?
Yeah, it launched on June 5th. And it's funny, maybe a month before it actually launched to space, it had tried to make an initial launch attempt to go to space. But hours before that liftoff, this was in May, there was some kind of problem with the rocket that they had to pause the countdown and roll it back to the integration facility. And while they did that, NASA and Boeing admitted that they saw a helium leak on Starliner. And helium is meant to pressurize Starliner's thrusters that it uses to maneuver in space. They spent a month analyzing the risks of this tiny little helium leak that was coming through a flange on one of the, valves connected to one of the thrusters, just one of the 28 thrusters. And NASA ultimately said, that's not that much of an issue. This is isolated to one tiny little system. We're still going to fly. And so they launched, expecting just that one helium leak to be the only helium leak. But then soon after, in the first 24 hours of its trek to the ISS, there were many more helium leaks, and the thrusters started glitching and failing. And just before Starliner was supposed to dock to the ISS, it didn't have approval to because it had 5 thrusters down. And so Boeing had to scramble up a software fix or a process fix in how those thrusters were fired to get them back online again. They revived 4 of the 5, and then they continued with their docking. And so the problems that they experienced in that first 24 hours of Starliner's flight set off, months of investigations on the ground and in space with Starliner still docked to the ISS. And the mission was supposed to be about 8 days, but because of those problems, it has been drawn out by over 2 months now. And the problems have now worsened so much that they're going to have to be stuck on the ISS, those 2 astronauts, while Starliner comes home in September.
Who makes that call that Starliner is not safe enough to go home with? Is that the astronauts? Is that NASA? Is that Boeing? How does that decision happen?
Yeah, it's not the astronauts and it's not Boeing necessarily, but it is basically a committee of many different NASA offices that meet in what's called these flight readiness reviews. And when they were contemplating using SpaceX's Crew Dragon to bring the astronauts home instead of Starliner, that was a pretty dramatic decision that unfolded over the course of maybe 2 weeks. Boeing has been trying to bring NASA a bunch of testing data that it claims shows that Starliner is safe enough to bring the astronauts home. And NASA was kind of buying Boeing more time to gather that data through ground testing. But ultimately, that didn't work out, of course, because NASA and its many engineering offices ultimately decided to use Crew Dragon instead. They deemed that the issues with the thrusters on Starliner were just too risky, too uncertain. They didn't have enough visibility into what actually was happening. And so they didn't have certainty that it wasn't going to cause a major problem carrying astronauts on the way home. So they ultimately polled, or they voted, most of these NASA offices to use Crew Dragon instead, while Boeing voted to use Starliner instead.
Do we know how the astronauts would vote?
That's a good question because, they're the lives on the line here, right? They didn't vote, but the astronaut office had a vote on the ground. And when we ask about how the astronauts feel throughout all of this, I'm thinking of myself, like if I had what was supposed to be an 8-day mission and it gets turned into an 8-month mission, I would not be very happy. I would be, freaking out in space. But, the difference between me and these astronauts is that these astronauts are very seasoned test pilots. They were in the military. They tested many different aircraft. And I think Sunny was a helicopter test pilot. And they were trained for these scenarios. Even though they had this short duration mission, they had prepared in the event that it would be drawn out into a much longer mission. And so when we ask NASA officials, how the astronauts feel, whether they objected to this decision, the response usually is these astronauts, their job is to follow the orders of what NASA decides. And we make decisions that are in the best interest of their safety, and they have to follow that. And so that's what has to happen. And the astronauts seem okay with that. We haven't had a lot of opportunities to talk to them directly.
Right.
But that's usually how it goes, is that, that's the reality, and that's what they signed up for as government astronauts. So they're not just going to be floating around and hanging out. NASA expects them to do science experiments, to continue doing science experiments. They've already participated in about 42 of them so far. And so that's expected to continue while they're on the station.
Hey, you! Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activated.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend, I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.
What do we know about spending that much time in space? How long is the usual ISS mission? What does that do to a person? It seems like an awfully long time.
Yeah. And, it seems even longer when we look at the ISS and its structure, too. It's this football field-sized science laboratory in space, only with a few windows that are open every now and then so that you can look out. And so if I were on the ISS, I would definitely not personally want to spend many months up there just because you're floating around what is essentially a bunch of computer racks. But, there's been a lot of research into how the human body responds to extended durations in the weightlessness of space. It's a huge area of research because NASA wants to go to the moon. They want to send people to Mars. And so before they do that, they need to know how the human body reacts to such an environment. And so for the past 2 decades of the ISS's life, scientists at NASA have been gathering that data. And the normal duration for an astronaut mission on the station is about 6 months. But there have been other contingencies where astronauts have had to spend a year, or, planned missions where astronauts have had to spend that long on the ISS too. So what we know is that it affects bone density. It has a bunch of effects that I can't really name off the top of my head, but there are clear effects that living in space for over 6 months, about a year, has on your body. It's not necessarily good. And, the future of this research is to figure out how we can make the bodies withstand these effects and tolerate these effects better.
We were already looking into doing this story and finding someone like yourself to speak to about it because it's so fascinating, both with Boeing involved and now the length of time that they'll be up there. So perhaps this is more of just an interesting adjacent thing, but I also understand Starliner is sitting up there now waiting to go back, and it started making strange noises last week. What's happening?
Yeah, it was aliens.
Right.
The aliens were trying to tell us how to fix Starliner. No, I'm kidding. But that definitely was a little news cycle that freaked a bunch of people out, and it wasn't convenient for Boeing after everything it's been experiencing so far with Starliner. But NASA put out a statement saying it was just feedback between the Starliner capsule and the ISS audio system, and it was not anything that showed a problem with the safety of the capsule or the safety systems of the ISS. So it was honestly a nothing burger.
But enough to grab some more headlines for poor Boeing. In the middle of all this.
Exactly, right.
So what happens, I guess, if something happens on the way home? What are we watching for or expecting when this now uncrewed ship tries to make it back?
Yeah, so since NASA made that decision on August 24th, Boeing has been configuring Starliner for its uncrewed return, which is a little different from a crewed return. You have to reconfigure the software to fly fully autonomously. The capsule has to know that there are no astronauts on board that can take over in the event of some kind of problem. So Boeing has been replacing the software ahead of an undocking that is supposed to happen on September 6th at about 6:04 p.m. And it's going to be a roughly 6-hour journey home, assuming the weather is nice on Earth and everything goes as planned. It's going to undock from the ISS, begin a kind of slow, gradual descent toward Earth's atmosphere. Along the way, it's going to be using its thrusters, the thrusters that have been messing up, when it was going to the ISS. So it's going to be a major test to see how those thrusters fare on a return leg. And then it is going to make its plunge into Earth's atmosphere just before midnight. And the landing in the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico is pegged for about 12:03 a.m. So all in all, a 6-hour return journey, and it's going to put its thrusters to the test. And by the way, this return leg of the trip is the most complex. Getting to the ISS is tough, and that is a major milestone that Starliner passed, despite the issues that were encountered along the way. But going back to Earth, where it has to separate from its propulsion system. So Starliner is this gumdropped crew pod, and then on the bottom of that is the service module, which has all the thrusters that have been messing up this whole mission. And so it's going to use that service module and the thrusters on that service module to position it for a, very accurate insertion into Earth's atmosphere. And just before it makes that plunge, it needs to eject that service module off of its gumdrop shaped, main core crew capsule. And that is a very, very meticulous, risky moment, especially if you're doing that with thrusters that have been messing up lately. And so if it goes as planned, then the service module burns up in the atmosphere. We never see that again. And then the crew capsule plunges through the atmosphere and experiences extreme heat, and then deploys parachutes and lands on airbags on the desert. But if it doesn't go good, if the crew capsule isn't able to separate from that service module, there's a number of reasons that could happen. There could be software that messes up that, millisecond specific kind of separation maneuver that could lead the whole thing to tumble and explode. That almost happened in the 2019 test. So it's going to be a really nerve-wracking thing to watch, and we'll see if Boeing can nail it.
Do we know the date for that yet?
Yeah, undocking will be Friday, September 6th at 6 p.m.
So as people are listening to this, it's happening this evening.
Right. So yeah, no, it's coming up, and I think NASA's going to be live streaming most of it. They should be live streaming most of it, and it's going to be very interesting to watch how it unfolds in that 6 hours.
If it lands properly, I know you mentioned that it was a different process between a crewed and uncrewed return, but if it lands properly, does that mean it's safe to assume that it would have made it back safely with the crew inside as well? And they're sort of sitting up there being like, damn.
That's a good question. And that's what Boeing is going to probably argue. It's like, see, Starliner was able to come back without a hitch. Astronauts could have been on it. And so our argument was right. But those are the risks that you have to take as a federal space agency with decades of experience launching astronauts to space and, frankly, losing astronauts on some of those shuttle missions many years ago. NASA had that in mind when it was making that decision. It had this risk posture that was built on the backs of those disasters, those tragic disasters, and it didn't want to take any chances of repeating that again, especially with this kind of politically sensitive commercial crew program where private companies are being relied upon to do things that only NASA was ever seen as able to do. So it didn't want to take risks. And if Starliner comes back safe without astronauts, there's not much you can do there. But the problems still persist on Starliner that need to be fixed and that Boeing needs to fix. And so it doesn't change that. It doesn't change that at all. And, the fact that it's coming back without astronauts is throwing into uncertainty its path to certification. Will Boeing have to do another mission with astronauts before it gets certified? Something that's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars? We don't know. Will NASA make Boeing turn this next crew operational mission that it was supposed to do after this flight into a part test, part operational mission? That seems more likely, but we don't know.
You've already kind of explained how it's not a race, quote unquote, but obviously there's competition involved between SpaceX and Boeing to get access to this government funding and obviously the exposure that goes with it and everything like that. How does this change the calculation and relationship in this kind of triangle of NASA, Boeing, and SpaceX, just given previous struggles and now obviously SpaceX is kind of having to pick up the slack here in terms of these astronauts?
Yeah, I think 5-6 years ago, nobody would have expected that we're in this position right now where a SpaceX capsule is having to bring back the astronauts that got there because of Boeing's problems. When we look back to the 2019 Starliner test, its first flight going to the ISS, it of course failed. And one of the many things that came out of that failure was an admission from NASA that they thought they gave too much oversight over SpaceX and not enough oversight over Boeing's development progress because they assumed SpaceX was the newcomer and Boeing was the, big, heavyweight, experienced space player that has been partners with NASA for decades. I mean, Boeing builds modules on the ISS. They maintain a lot of operations on the ISS. They are building most of NASA's Space Launch System rocket. That's the centerpiece of the Moon program. And they were involved in the Apollo program too. So Boeing's been around for a while. And when it experienced its first major failure with the Starliner program in 2019, NASA came out and said, we thought Boeing was going to be better. We didn't think Boeing would have needed the oversight that we instead gave to SpaceX because SpaceX was the newcomer here. And we thought they were going to have a tougher time developing this capsule system. And so that 2019 failure really changed a lot for how NASA deals with Boeing and how Boeing deals with NASA. And this latest mission is kind of a continuation of that. NASA's going to have to be very careful in how it manages Boeing's next steps on this program. Boeing, of course, has a lot of other interests that it has to keep in mind, such as reviving and fixing the problems it's experiencing on the aviation side of this business, while it also increasingly sees space as an area that it can't really compete in because, SpaceX has become so dominant. And so Boeing faces pressure to stay in this program by NASA because NASA wants to have 2 different rides to the ISS for its astronauts in case, Crew Dragon never fails and it wants to be able to lean on Starliner to bring them up on the ISS instead, even though that's kind of hard to imagine right now. So Boeing is probably going to stay in the program, because it kind of maybe sees some commercial value to it further into the future. And NASA, of course, wants that to be the case because they need a second ride.
Joey, thank you so much for explaining this, and hopefully those astronauts are doing well, and I guess we'll watch tonight to see what happens to the Starliner.
Yeah, we'll see. Thank you so much for having me.
Joey Roulette, space reporter at Reuters. Space reporter, by the way, is an amazing job title. I want it. That was The Big Story. For more from us, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can always send us feedback on this episode or any other by calling us and leaving a voicemail 416-935-5935 or by sending an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Joe Fish is the lead producer of The Big Story. Robin Simon is also a producer on this show. Matt Kesselman handles our sound design. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Mary Jubrin is our audience lead. Diana Kay is our manager of business development. And I am Jordan Heath Rawlings, your host and executive producer. The Big Story is created by Frequency Podcast Network, which is a division of Rogers. Thanks for listening. We'll have a little treat for you in the feed this weekend, and we'll all be back with a fresh big story for you on Monday morning.
Hey, you. Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activate it.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend, I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.